Welcome to the MyLifeInConcert.com podcast. I'm your host, Various Artists, and please join me as I travel back and revisit every live show I've seen from 1975 to the present.
This is the first time you've toured, and why have you decided to go out on the road now?
I need to get my charts together, which I'm doing.
Marianne Faithfull burst onto the world stage in 1964 at the height of the pop 60s, creating a signature hit via her bittersweet rendition of the Mick Jagger-Keith Richards number, As Tears Go By. During the mid-60s, Marianne released a number of albums and singles alternating between folk and pop styles, sometimes just plain old folk pop, and also became Jagger's girlfriend, with the two of them becoming one of rock's first tabloid couples. She split with Jagger at the start of the 70s, and the rest of the decade was pretty rough for her, before re-emerging in the last months of 1979, after signing with Island Records and then releasing one of the all-time great comeback albums ever, Broken English. And she hasn't quit since. Now, Broken English did particularly well here in Canada, hitting the top 30 and eventually going platinum. Indeed, Marianne had always done well here in Canada, with her initial hit version of As Tears Go By peaking at number 2, versus 9 in the UK and 28 in the US. When Faithfull released her follow-up to Broken English in 1981, Dangerous Acquaintances, it just missed the Canadian top 10. So when she released her third Island album, A Child's Adventure, in 1983, it was time for her to do a proper tour, and it made sense for the tour to start here in Canada, do a small tour of Canada first, where her records were particularly popular. So, where did Marianne launch this Canadian jaunt? Hey everyone, I'm your host, Various Artists. This is the MyLifeInConcert.com podcast, and please join me for episode 28, where I jump in the time machine and head back for Marianne Faithfull's debut Canadian show at a packed to way beyond capacity bar here in the Forest City, overflowing with a heavily refreshed and excited audience of faithful fanatics on an unforgivably sweltering summer night as I look back on concert number 21, Marianne Faithfull at Fryfogle's here in London, Ontario, Canada, Monday, August 15th, 1983. And this episode is called Dangerous Acquaintances. Also, the ticket price was $20. Now that's $53 in Canadian money in 2022. Greetings, dear listeners, both new and returning, and thanks for tuning in. I'd like to remind listeners to check out the MyLifeInConcert.com website and blog chronicling this and many other shows between 1975 and now, with my original blog entry that I initially published over on Open Salon back up in 2012. That's up on the website. And for this and many other shows, there's the overview of the show and my life and the time, but always there's extra information about the shows that I maybe don't go into the podcast. There's often photos, and there's one photo of this show, and I'll get back to that photo a little bit later on up on the blog, as well as links, the original ticket, ephemera, and related Spotify playlists and more. And on the topic of Spotify playlists, you can hear my Spotify playlists. Can I say Spotify playlists more? No, I don't think I even want to. Anyway, under my Various Artists username, but it's just as easy to search for MyLifeInConcert.com, because I usually put that at the end of the title, or MLIC, followed by a prompt, as all my playlists start that way, or simply follow me on Spotify. And for this episode, I have two playlists up. MLIC prompt, Marianne Faithfull, time span, C90, 1964 to 2021, a cassette length overview of Marianne Faithfull's whole career, cherry picking the best of each LP or era from 1964 to 2021. And I'm starting to put up some of these time span playlists that go across an artist's career who's kind of had a bit of a long career, and not so much all the greatest hits, but kind of the best of every moment as they go along, and choosing the cassette length, because, you know, back in the day we used to make a lot of compilation cassettes of an artist, and it's a really good length to sort of use as a limit, shall we say, to what you put on. And then there's also MLIC, Marianne Faithfull, Dangerous Acquaintances, VA's Fave Tracks, 1964 to 2021, and that's more of an in-depth box set length compilation spanning her whole career. Also, please like, follow, and subscribe on our Facebook and Instagram pages, as well as our YouTube channel, which feature not only the podcast, but live footage from shows that Kabbalah and I have shot along the way, as well as vintage clips. And remember to hit that notification bell for new episodes. Now, back to the gig. Now, this show has got to be one of the 3 or 4 best live gigs I ever saw here in London, Ontario. One of the best I ever saw, but here in London, it's one of the top 3 or 4. And at the beginning of the episode, you heard a small clip from an interview I did with Marianne Faithfull in 1989 on the occasion of her returning here to the Forest City to play another splendid gig at Kipling's, which was in the south end of the city. And when my series hits that time, mid to late 80s to early 90s, there's going to be a lot of shows that I saw at Kipling's that are going to be featured in the series. So anyway, I got to interview her by phone. I was a CHRW DJ for many years, and I was at this time. And I interviewed her by phone in advance of the show. And later on in the episode, I'm going to be playing that 4-minute interview that I did, which initially aired on CHRW. It was chunked down from the original. I'll talk more about that at the time, but that's coming up a bit later. I was also lucky enough to go backstage after that Kipling's gig and meet her personally. And she was so lovely, both during the interview and in person. And I'll eventually be doing a full entry and episode on that show as concert number 63, Blazing Away, Marianne Faithfull at Kipling's, London, Ontario, Canada, Wednesday, November 1st, 1989. Of course, it's going to take a while to get there because I'm only at concert number 21 now. And admittedly, I have had less episodes up this year, and that's going to continue through early next year. Just my life's so busy, and I'm working and back in school again. So haven't lost enthusiasm for the podcast series, just really busy life. Hopefully I'll be able to do more next year. And of course, by the time I get to 88, 89, and 90, those were years that were particularly packed with live shows, with her second show here happening in between 2 Toronto concerts, the Water Boys at the Concert Hall and Paul McCartney at Sky Dome. So there's lots and lots and lots coming up down the road in mylifeinconcert.com. So anyway, as for Marianne and this gig, well, first a bit about her and my fandom. So Marianne Faithfull has occupied mental real estate in my consciousness since I was but a wee lad. I grew up in a house that was saturated with the music of the Rolling Stones, and sometimes you're around something and it touches you or doesn't. There's other things that were going on in my life that didn't really have an impact on me, but as I've discussed in many episodes, music did. And I've talked about the Beatles, but also the Rolling Stones. I'm a lifelong, massive Stones fan, and they made a very, very big impact. My elder siblings were playing their records a lot, especially my brother, but also the first album I ever owned, and I discussed this in the Keith Richards episode 23, was Out of Our Heads, the North American version, which I actually prefer to the British version. It's one of those rare things where I think the North American version is better. But I got that as my first album from a UK visiting aunt and uncle, and one of the first singles I ever owned, which I still have, Dandelion by the Rolling Stones. And again, I've got a picture of that up on the Keith Richards episode about that I put up earlier this year when I saw him in Detroit in 1988. And the Stones themselves, by the way, will be coming up down the line the first night of the Steel Wheels tour at CNE Stadium. What an incredible show that was. And 7th row center seats. So sweet, sweet show way down the line. But anyway, the Stones were always around. I was always following Stones-related headlines and hijinks, which were, all the time in the late 60s and early 70s, when they're sort of at the height of their bad boy, sort of living that all out period. And of course, Mick and Marianne were a couple, and their exploits in their time as a couple in the late 60s always got a profusion of ink in the press. And of course, the most famous being the Redlands incident at Keith Richards' house and the fur rug and all that. You know all this. Of course, she had first burst on the scene recording that version of As Tears Go By that Mick Jagger and Keith Richards had written. Now, they weren't a couple at the time, but became that a little bit later on. But it wasn't just that. Particularly in the UK, she had a number of hit singles in the mid-60s and released a series of albums around that time. And then, but kind of took up with Mick Jagger, and it was her career sort of faded for a while. But still, she was a very striking presence. I liked her records. And when the Stones' Sticky Fingers came out, Sister Morphine is on there, and I can't remember how. She's credited now. She wasn't at the time, but I can't remember, everyone sort of knew that she had written that. And in fact, there's a famous quote from Marianne Faithfull, and I quote, "I've been living off the royalties to Sister Morphine for 10 years, which is really bizarre. Don't tell me drugs don't pay." So anyway, but by the time Sticky Fingers came out, she and Mick were no more. They were long estranged. Her music career and her acting career, which had taken off at one point, this was all in the past now. The 1970s were not kind to Marianne, a time marked by her debilitating heroin use, alcoholism, anorexia nervosa, and shifting around from squat to squat in Soho. So not a good time for her. However, she did pop up on the radar in the 70s in a few ways. Most memorably for me was when she performed with David Bowie as part of his 1980 floor show, which was shot at the Marquee. It was sort of the last gasp of the Spiders after the final gig. I think it was his last show with Mick Ronson, and she is on that, and the two of them do this kind of rough take on Sonny and Cher's I Got You Babe, but it has a lot of charm. And she appeared wearing a backless nun's dress, although we didn't see the backless part on television. And later in the decade, she was in the news when the Sex Pistols movie, the proposed Sex Pistols movie that never got made, Who Killed Bambi, which was going to be directed by sexploitation legend Russ Meyer, who made one of my favorite movies of all time, Faster Pussycat Kill Kill. And it was written by Roger Ebert, unbelievably, who actually posted the script up on his website not too long before he died. Well, she was supposed to play Sid Vicious's mother in the movie, and there was going to be this made-to-shock incest scene, and she got a lot of press from that. Well, that was pretty much it. Now, in terms of music, she did put out an album in 1976 called Dreaming My Dreams, and that album and the song were big hits in Ireland, but didn't really do anything anywhere else. And I really liked that album. I heard it later, which I'll get to. But she had also cut an album in 1971 called Rich Kids Blues, and that didn't get released until the mid-80s, and it was actually a package together put out through Castle Communication, a double album with Rich Kid Blues as the first disc and Dreamin' My Dreams is the second. And I didn't realize what any of this was. I just bought it at the time. There was no liner notes, but I really liked the albums, but I wasn't sure like where, when, and where were they from, that sort of thing. But that was pretty much it for her recording in the 70s, just the one album, and then the other that was released later, until Broken English. Before then, she'd been more in the Where Are They Now file. But again, as the decade lurched to a close, I started reading these stories in the British press. I was an NME nut, and that Marianne Faithfull had signed Island Records. She had recorded a new album. She had been sort of reinvigorated by punk's anger and energy, and this new record was supposed to tap into this more contemporary new wave punkish sound, whatever. And it sounded interesting, and the process attracted curiosity, but it seemed as interesting as it was to actually likely come to fruition. It sounded like another one of these things where it sounded almost like this novelty that wasn't going to happen. So virtually no one was prepared for the game-changing tour de force that was Broken English when it appeared in October 1979. Arriving on the cusp of the 70s, morphing into the 80s, Broken English was not only leagues superior to anything anyone had anticipated, but was a surprise international hit. As I mentioned, it did particularly well here in Canada, going gold and then platinum. Now, up on the site for the blog entry, I have a series of 5 albums, well, a picture of 5 albums, Broken English and 4 other covers, that for me sort of epitomized that moment, sort of like the December 79, January 1980, January, February 1980, that decade morph. And there's 5 albums there that just about everyone I knew at that time owned and was listening to. And that's this one, The Clash's London Calling, the debuts from The Specials and The Pretenders, and XTC's Drums and Wires. I think you could throw the Jam's Setting Suns in there. And earlier on in the podcast, I kind of got out of this. I talk about sort of music or albums of the era I was listening to. And Broken English, it's just a soundtrack for that period. But all through the winter, spring, summer, it's just everyone was listening to it. And so I was thinking of other albums around that time that encapsulate that period, especially maybe a bit later, like Spring. When I think of Spring 1980, there's 2 that immediately come to mind, and one is PIL's Metal Box. And Keith Levine just died. So sad. That album made such a huge impact. Wobble's great bass playing and Levine's guitar. That and the other big post-punk moment, the Gang of Four's Entertainment. I've always listened to them, but they're indelibly linked with that Spring, as was hearing Joy Division's Transmission and then the Closer album later in the summer. Also, Wires 154, incredible third, like trippy third album. The Ramones' End of the Century, Squeeze, Argy Bargy, and then a little bit later on, Bob Marley's Uprising. Also the Cramps songs, The Lord Taught Us. So that sort of end of the 70s, early mid 1980, that's kind of some of the chunks of the soundtrack of the time for me. I also have a playlist of what I was listening to in 1980. And I've got that up on the site. I'm doing a series as I go through for each year, and this was my life. MLIC Prompt VA's 1980, the soundtrack to my year. Anyway, it's there if you're interested. Now, as for Broken English, it was both raw and sleek, and it was completely modern. It was difficult to classify genre blend. Usually, those are the sort of albums I'm drawn to. That pulled from punk, new wave, disco, rock, blues, and reggae, presaging that hybrid nature that was emblematic of a lot of the best early 80s music. And Gone was Faithfull's soft schoolgirl serenade from the 60s, replaced by an altogether more expressive, gravelly, cigarette and whiskey-soaked instrument that was knowing, world-weary, and weather-beaten, and fit her new music like a glove. Now, even though she only had a partial hand in writing 3 of the LP's 8 tracks, Broken English came off as a distinctly personal expression. Each song was carefully selected, resulting in an autobiographical work that reflected Faithfull's life, struggles, and interests. And it really ran the gamut, not just in terms of a genre blend, but also the topic matter, and what was included in it, especially some of the covers. They're just amazing. It's got the definitive interpretation of Shel Silverstein's The Ballad of Lucy Jordan. And then there's her cover of John Lennon's Working Class Hero. And of course, Plastic Ono Band. It's on my list of my favorite albums, also on the site, top 15 and the short list. One of my favorite albums ever and one of Lennon's best songs. Her cover, though, is so amazing. It's one of my favorite cover versions anyone's ever done of a song. And of course, the interesting topics and the songwriting just go right through the album, starting with the title track, which she co-wrote. And it's about the late German journalist come terrorist, Ulrich Meinhof of the Baader Meinhof gang, the RAF. And if you were a person around in the 70s, my age, of course, you knew this was big. They were in the news all the time. It was a very terrifying time in that sense. To her own heroin addiction, which is addressed in What's the Hurry. But probably the most controversial track on the album was a sexually explicit song with the lyrics by poet Heathcote Williams about sexual jealousy and anger. Why'd you do it? With very, very explicit language, as well as just her version of Brain Drain, which she didn't reverse the gender, and just this very sort of whatever delivery that just suits it perfectly. Just the right attitude. So aesthetically and thematically, it's a perfect album. And again, it's also one of when I was on Open Salon years ago, where I started the blog part, somebody did a call out for people to list their top 15 albums and talk about them personally. And I did that and then made a long short list. There's about another 60 albums. And again, Broken English is one of them. It's just, as long as I'm alive, I will listen to this album. So, of course, the problem with making such a seminal, definitive album is, how do you follow it? Well, on one hand, it's tough to do, but she's done it because she has had an absolutely extraordinary career. And it's dawned on me recently, she never made a bad album. She's never made a bad album. She's been recording fairly regularly since 1964. There's some gaps in there, but she's had a recording and performing career the whole time. And, well, most of the whole time. She's just never made a bad album. Now, there's a couple that are very much for special moments, like her new one, the Recitation LP, She Walks in Beauty, or The Seven Deadly Sins. But they're still excellent albums, even if you kind of have to be in a certain mood. And while I followed her through the 80s, in the 90s I wasn't listening to her as much, but kind of came back in the 2000s and really came back in the 2010s, and I've gone back to listen to some albums I've missed, and just my respect for her as an artist has just grown and grown. It's incredible catalog. And that extends too to her very early pop albums, or folk and pop, but more pop from the 60s, which they're not on the level of her later recordings, but they're good. They're really good, and there's some great tracks on them. And actually, in that 1989 interview, I asked her what she thought about that, what she thought about her pop material. So I'm going to play this little segment. The whole interview is coming later. Now, as I'll talk later, I don't have the master tapes for this interview, so all I have is the edited and mixed interview that they aired, which was chopped down. A lot of stuff was lost. But anyway, at one point they put a song in the middle. They put As Tears Go By, so I've tried to edit around that, especially putting this up on YouTube. I don't want to get hit for any copyright stuff. But anyway, here's what she had to say about her early recordings in 1989.
How do you regard your early pop hits from the 1960s today?
Like it. I mean, it's not stuff I would do now, except As Tears Go By. I mean, I never kept my records and I never listened to them. I just made them and then they went out, and I've never sort of held on to them. But I did happen to hear them, and I came away feeling like, well, that was a lot of work, you know. Some of it was all right.
Mm-hmm.
I could see that it was quite good, and it was okay, you know.
Mm-hmm.
It was rather sweet.
It was of its time.
Yes.
So that interview took place on the occasion of her second trip here to London, which I was talking about at Kipling's. But of course, she had played here first in 1983, the show that we're looking at in this episode. And as I said, it was her first stop on this tour, and fortuitously, she played my local watering hole / second home during 1983. Fryfogle's, one of the greatest bars that London, Ontario ever saw. Now, her appearance here at Fry's was just 10 days after I had attended that third and final police picnic at CNE Stadium in Toronto. And of course, that was the last podcast, episode 27. If you get a chance, check that out. It was a fun one. Noelle and Phil dropped by and shared their memories. It was a really fun interview. But certainly, this gig, this Marianne Faithfull gig, was like the big buzz of the summer. Well, this and the John Cale show, which I looked at in episode 26. But like, everyone was just about having kittens when it was announced that she would be coming. Now, in that period between Broken English and this gig, Marianne had released 2 more island albums. 1981's Dangerous Acquaintances, of which I have named this episode after, and you'll see why a little bit later, and 1983's A Child Adventure, which she was touring on when I saw her. That was the new album, and she was promoting it. Now, a lot of people feel that the follow-ups were weak, and they were sort of criticized in that regard. They didn't have their predecessors' sort of like topical bite or sonic bite. And it's hard to sort of follow Broken English, but I got to say, I love these albums. And I'd gone for a period not listening to them, and then when I went back to them, they may not be the equal of Broken English, but who cares? They're great albums. I just love these albums. I still enjoy listening to them so much. And they perform very, very well here. Dangerous Acquaintances just missed the top 10 here in Canada, and A Child's Adventure was in the top 50. So everyone I knew was pretty amped about her coming. And in the London Free Press review by Peter Lorre, I'll be reading that later on, and that's on the website as well. He mentions that, quote, advance tickets for the Fryfogle show sold out in 2 days, and a good 6 hours before Faithfull came on stage, there were fans lined up outside the bar to get in. Now, I'll be, again, reading the whole thing later. Now, as for me, I seem to recall going for dinner before the gig with my brother-in-law and my sister and possibly Lady B, and I think we went to, was it called Angelo's? It was an Italian food place that they made the best panzerottis. We used to go there for panzerotti all the time on Clarence Street. I think it's Angelo's. And I think we went there, and I think Lady B was with us. So I think we ate and then wandered over after. And we got there sort of mid-evening, shortly after the openers, who were this rockabilly band, the Wise Guys. They had left the stage, so I didn't see the openers. Now, I saw Fryfogle's. It was a long, narrow bar. I saw it really packed many times, but this was the most packed I ever recall seeing it. They literally had to shoehorn people into this den of human saturation. Now, on this note of the club being this packed, like it was fun because, you know, everyone was there. I'll talk about this more in a moment. But when I think back to this night, oh my goodness, when that tragic fire happened in that packed Rhode Island nightclub in 2003, where Great White were playing and their pyrotechnics were set off and it caught stuff on fire and the club burned down and 100 people were killed and hundreds more were injured. Awful. When that happened, the first thing that came to my mind, the first thing was I thought of this Marianne Faithfull gig. because I've thought about this through the years. Like, if anything had gone wrong that night, you would have had a lot of dead people. It was almost double the capacity. Now, luckily, the night went off without a hitch, but it's one of those things at the time, it's where now I don't think I'd be so comfortable in that level of sardineness in an enclosed location. That even has nothing to do with COVID and all that. But I have thought back to that, and it's a little disturbing to think about. This also meant that forays to the bar and back required strategic navigation and optimum patience on this steamingly hot August night. But as I said, it was fun. Phil wasn't there, unfortunately, and pretty much almost everyone I knew was there. Everyone was there that night, and everyone was very high-spirited. And so, it took you ages to get to the bar. It took you ages to get served while you were there. But you were spending most of your time talking with everyone because you were crammed in and you tended to be standing next to someone you knew anyway. And you'd be having these very casual but exaggerated exchanges, very, very inebriated, casual, exaggerated exchanges with everyone you ran into. Oh my God, people were shit-faced on this night. Oh man, everyone was just right off their tits because everyone had arrived early. Everyone staked out their place, everyone started drinking, and everyone was in super high spirits. So, like on this night, of course, I'm sure we would have herbalized up before going in and had a couple of beers. So it had a nice buzz going, but it was too hard to drink a lot because it was hard to get served. And so we had a nice buzz on, but I think we were, for me, I was, for a change, in relatively buzzed but muted spirits, but just everyone was so wiped out. Whoa. And so, they'd had hours to drink and imbibe and ingest and whatever. So when Marianne Faithfull came out on the stage, I would say that the crowd erupted in jubilation rather than just sort of did a few woohoos. Erupting in jubilation is probably the best phrase to describe the packed, partying patrons' passionate welcome for Faithfull when she arrived. Now, the Free Press writer's observation that Monday's crowd seemed almost out of place with their screams and shouts when paired against a mellowing Faithfull is an accurate one, although I'm not sure that out of place is fair, given that the enthusiasm was genuine and fueled by just everyone just being really cut. But still, there was this amusing, contrasting gap between a lot of the largely mid-tempo, sedate dynamics of the music versus the crowd's overly demonstrative party time response. But, she didn't seem to mind one iota. Remember, she'd seen everything and has seen everything. And I remember her, she kind of seemed to take it all in with an impression of cheerful bemusement, entertained by the sea of barstool love. As Laurie from the Free Press put it, she, quote, seemed content with a smile. Now, there is one picture of the gig I've been able to come by, and it's up on the site, and it was taken by the late Linda Moran. And she had posted it up, and I didn't really know Linda back in the day, but we had just started communicating on Facebook and private messaging, and we were having some interesting conversations about the scene back in the day. And when she posted this, I asked, can I put this up on my website? And she said, no problem. And I was actually going to speak to her. I had talked to her about interviewing her for this show, and shockingly, she passed. She passed away. It was so sad. Well, I would have loved to have spoken with her about this show. And I put the message out to people who might be interested in being interviewed. And it was a combination of several people getting back saying, I was there but don't remember anything. Gee, I wonder why. Or they were, but they just didn't feel comfortable being interviewed. But anyway, thanks to the late Linda Moran for letting me put up the photo. And you can see there, you kind of get an idea of how packed it is. And also another person who has passed is my brother-in-law, who many of you may have known as Sparky back in the day. And we had reconnected about a decade ago, and we had a number of chats. This is when I was writing the original blog. So I spoke with him when I was writing the blog entry for Open Salon in 2012. And this is what he remembered about the gig. He said, he reminded me of her decidedly casual stage attire on this oppressively humid night, composed of a cut-off blue jeans and an ill-fitting black tank top, and as he added, those pendulous breasts. And in Linda's photo, you can see that he's right. He remembered what she was wearing exactly. So, well done, Sparky, and or Rick, as he would have been known to others. As for me, what's burnt into my brain is Faithfull up at that mic, not really moving a whole lot, but she didn't have a whole lot of room anyway, and sandwiched between these musicians and all this equipment, holding the mic in her right hand and keeping time by repeatedly slapping her thigh to the rhythm, like her left thigh with her left hand, keeping the rhythm through the show. And you can see that in the photo too. As for the set itself, unsurprisingly, Broken English launched the set, and there was a lot of selections from its namesake LP featured prominently throughout the night. The churning, syncopated opening riff of Why'd You Do It triggered walls of hurrahs. And, of course, her version of Working Class Hero, John Lennon's Working Class Hero, concluded with Faithfull looking upwards and shouting something to the effect of the way I remembered as she said, "That was for you, Johnny," or something like that, although Sparky remembered it more, her dedicating it to Johnny, wherever you may be. The reality is probably somewhere in the middle. However, the number I most recall, and for the wrong reason, is when she did the Ballad of Lucy Jordan, because they just couldn't get the synths, which is the main part of the song, in sync with the rest of the band, resulting in an off-kilter performance that never really properly gelled. But that was the only track that I recall not working. Now, of course, she was touring A Child's Adventure, so that album was represented very well, and I particularly remember the smoky, languid, reflective Times Square coming off as really well performed. But I really remember it as an example of the songs, of the evening's incongruous moments of artist-audience dissimilitude, because you have this somber, delicate song, and of course that was kind of the one that had been the single, so a lot of people knew it, and she performed it, and as she's coming to the end of this, very soft, reflective tune, the response is something like this. And, she just seemed genuinely pleased throughout it all, grinning and taking in the public adulation. I got the impression she was really enjoying herself up there. She looked and sounded terrific and together, and that sort of benefited her public persona from the early 80s, which emphasized that she was now all cleaned up and her life was harnessed. And of course, as I was to find out shortly thereafter, i.e. the next day, that mantra was more marketing message than reality. As I was privy to some backstage info via one of the organizers that made it clear that Faithfull, that really wasn't the case with Faithfull. And I'm not going to be gossipy and indiscreet, and I'll just simply put what she herself has said many, many times long ago, is that she still really wasn't in a great place, and it was a fall that she took in the mid-'80s down the stairs in a broken jaw that really kind of triggered her life turning around. But, whatever, we all have our stuff, and whatever was going on in her life off stage, and her performance was great. She was amazing, just amazing. So now I'm going to read the London Free Press review that was written by Peter Lorre. And again, I've got it up on the blog for you to read the original article. So the article is entitled Marianne's Faithful Fans Jam into Fryfogles by Peter Lorre. Why Marianne Faithfull would first pick a London bar for her first Canadian performance is certainly a mystery, but the 350 fans who packed Fryfogle's Monday night weren't about to ask why. So I'm interjecting here. I think Fry's was more about a 200 people bar. There was 350. There you go. London was the first solo stop in a 5-city Canadian tour for the 36-year-old singer who gained notoriety during the 60s as the girlfriend of Rolling Stone Mick Jagger. The Wise Guys, a rockabilly trio from Little Rock, Arkansas, started off the evening with a high-energy set that was all sweat and verve, tearing through classics such as Not Fade Away as if for the first time. Faithfull, whose voice has been described as a cross between Betty Davis and Tallulah Bankhead, opened with broken English from her 1979 comeback album of the same name. Her show was surprisingly laid back and optimistic, a dramatic contrast to much of her pessimistic lyrics. Faithfull herself seemed relaxed and in control of the show, which was skewed toward songs from the hit Broken English album. Much of the show reflected the mood of her newest album, A Child's Adventure, which is slower and slicker than anything Faithfull has done to date, such as the ballad Times Square. If Faithfull seems to be mellowing, her audience isn't. Monday's crowd seem almost out of place with their screams and shouts, while Faithfull seemed content with a smile. Advance tickets for the Fryfogle show sold out in 2 days, according to Downtown Record Store's spokesman. And a good 6 hours before Faithfull came on stage, there were fans lined up outside the bar to get in. And I remember that now, that when it was announced, my brother-in-law saying, I remember him getting tickets, saying, we've got to get tickets right away. This will sell out. And indeed it did within 2 days. All right. So following this tour, she had an extended career layoff, really, which was devoting of time to getting sober, which really turned her life around. And she resumed full-time recording in 1987, recasting herself as a torch singer, which made a lot of sense, with the excellent Hal Wilner-produced Strange Weather. Now, they had met via her participation in his Kurt Weill project Lost in the Stars, an album I love dearly. It's one of my favorite albums of the 80s. Now, she followed Strange Weather a few years later with the live album Blazing Away. It has a couple of studio numbers on it. But she recorded it in 89, released it in 1990. Now, she came through London the second time in 1989, as she was saying earlier on, as you'll hear again, to get her chops together for the live album, which became Blazing Away, recorded in New York. And this was one of the shows that she did. And she did another Canadian tour in advance of recording there. So that's when I interviewed her, and I'm going to play the interview now. Unfortunately, I don't have the master recording of this. They took the tape from me, and it was been fairly crudely edited, and I know we talked about more stuff, and it's not here, but this is all I have. I don't have the master of this one. And unfortunately, it's one of those times on CHRW that happened a few times, happened with a Kim Gordon interview as well, where someone was supposed to show up and engineer the interview and nobody showed. And so I had to record it on this crappy cassette deck in there, which ran slow, which meant that everything you recorded on it played back fast. So the tape that I have, which has been edited and they added music that I've had to try to cut out, I'm kind of sounding like I'm verging on Elvin of the Chipmunks. So I have corrected the speed and pitch. I think I've done a pretty decent job, so I don't sound like, a chipmunk. Although Cublet thinks I sound a little bit like Kermit the Frog in this one. It's not easy being green. So there's some real Kermit for you. So anyway, here's the short interview. It's pretty interesting. She talks about Hal Wilner, also Allen Ginsberg, also that she'd been teaching lyric writing in Colorado, and also the upcoming live album. So anyway, here's the interview.
You've been keeping a low public profile since the release of Strange Weather 2 years ago. Have there been any projects that you've been working on during that time?
Well, no.
So you've just been sort of taking it easy?
Yes, I've just been living, you know.
Now, I understand that you're going to be part of an upcoming project involving some Kurt Weill tunes.
Yes, that's in December, with an orchestra and a choir.
Mm-hmm. Are you going to be recording this for an album?
We're hoping to be invited to do it in other places, and we will record it eventually. This is the first time we've done it, so we need to see what it's like. I mean, we've wanted to do for a long time.
Who's involved with the project?
Hal Wilner, who sort of put it together, who produced Strange Weather, and is a friend of mine. And he particularly has always wanted to do this with me. But, you know, you need a real orchestra, whole scene to do it. But the Weill Foundation don't let you do it unless you do it properly, which I think is good.
So is this something that came about with your involvement in the Lost in the Stars Kurt Weill tribute album?
It came about, one of the things I haven't been taking it easy, I have been working, it's just you wouldn't know about it. I've been teaching at Naropa College in Boulder in the summer school, 2 weeks, and I've been doing this now for 3 years, and I've been doing it with Hal. And it came about sort of just before we went to do that, actually, and it was amazing that they just asked us if we'd do it. So, but I mean, yes, my relationship with Hal Wilner started with Lost in the Stars.
How did you come to be involved in the Lost in the Stars album?
He asked me, and I said I would, and I did, and we became friends.
Well, were you familiar with the other two tribute albums that he had put together before those, the one for Nina Rota and Thelonious Monk?
I must say I wasn't, no, but I heard them, he gave them to me, and I listened to them, and I thought they were great.
This is the first time you've toured in many years. Why have you decided to go out on the road now?
Well, I'm doing a live record in New York in November, so I need to get my charts together, which I'm doing.
How many dates are you playing on this tour?
Like 8 dates in Canada. Then I'm doing 3 more in Paris. Then I go to New York. And then after that, next year, we'll be doing some dates in Germany and some dates in Ireland, where I live, and probably some dates in Australia.
What kind of material are you playing on this tour? Are you doing any of the Kurt Weill stuff?
This is with the rhythm guitarist, Barry Reynolds. Who wrote Guilt and Broken English and lots of my songs. No, we can't do Kurt Weill like that. We will do some of that stuff on the new record, which is the live record, which will be recorded in New York in November.
How do you regard your early pop hits from the 1960s today?
I like it. I mean, it's not stuff I would do now, except as Tears Go By. I mean, I never kept my records, and I never listened to them. I just made them, and then they went out, and I've never sort of held on to them. But I did happen to hear them, and I came away feeling like, well, that was a lot of work, you know. Some of it was all right. I could see that it was quite good, and it was okay, you know. It was rather sweet.
It was of its time.
Yes.
What kind of music are you listening to these days?
I listen to blues and jazz and classical music.
Now, you mentioned earlier in the interview that you're teaching, or have been teaching, at Colorado. Now, what have you been teaching there?
Lyric writing.
How did that come about?
Well, I'm a friend of Allen Ginsberg, the poet, and he runs this summer school for 2 weeks in July. And he asked me if I would do a workshop 3 years ago, and I did it, and it went real well. So I've been doing it ever since in the summer.
So, how did you find the teaching experience?
I loved it. I love teaching. It's great fun.
Well, to wrap up here, I'd once again like to remind listeners of the show tonight at Kipling's. It's going to be a real treat once again for London to get to see Marianne Faithfull perform, as you did perform here a few years ago at Fryfogle's. And I'd like to thank you for taking time out to speak to us here at Radio Western.
Thank you.
So there you have it, my interview with Marianne Faithfull in 1989. As for the ending of this evening, Marianne's Faithfull departed Fry's full of giddy goodness, and while almost everyone I knew socially at that time was there that night, the only really specific interactions I can remember were with MZ, who's been part of this series. because she had gotten there early. Wasn't with us, and she had met up with another nicknamed Chubby Jr., which is actually a name from the time, it was very unusual because he was sort of a big chunky guy and he was a major speed freak. So usually those two things didn't go together, hence the name. And he was kind of one of the dealers on the scene, and he had just sort of gotten this windfall of acid that he had been personally sampling and trying to flog. And apparently, amid copious beerage and whatnot, he indulged MZ in a few tabs so they could trip together. And by the time we got there, they were already flying the friendly skies and well into their LSD merriment. And amid their merriment, at the end of the evening, was the following activity. Now, again, Fry's was this long, narrow club. And in the middle of the club, there was the dance floor on the eastern part of the club. Then you had the dance floor, and just sort of south part of the dance floor, you had stairs that went downstairs to a club that they sort of more of a drinking club they sometimes had on weekends. Also, the bathrooms were down there. And there was a partial wall that, of course, went along the other three perimeters where the stairs weren't. And it was about, say, 3.5, 4 feet, 3 feet high. And people would lean on it all the time. And also there would be a huge collection of empty beer bottles by the end of the night, because everyone would lean up against the partial wall, drink, and watch the band. So by night's end, it was just packed with beer bottles. And someone must have knocked a beer bottle off, or one of them knocked a beer bottle off, and it flew down the stairs and smashed into bits. Gales of chuckles from the tripping twosome ensued, leading CJ and MZ to pitch one empty bottle down the stairs after another, their cackling mirth increasing with the sound of each successive crashing bottle. Meanwhile, revelers carefully tried to avoid the carnage and flying glass as they made their way up and down the stairs en route to and from the bathrooms. Dangerous acquaintances indeed. Well, this wraps up my look back at this incredible show by Marianne Faithfull in 1983. Up next, okay, folks, this is the big one, the ultimate, the single show that I was probably most juiced to ever see when I, along with my cohort Miss Bennies, who's been in this series, we went to the Beat REM show together, and 60,000 other fans, all of whom going absolutely freaking bananas, moseyed on down to a packed CNE Exhibition Stadium on the Sunday night of a sweltering Labor Day weekend in 1983 for David Bowie and his Serious Moonlight tour, of course, touring behind his worldwide smash hit album, Let's Dance, with the great Rough Trade opening the show and warming up the troops. On the exact same weekend, a year earlier, I'd seen The Clash. And in that podcast for the show, episode 18, and the blog entry for concert 12, I discuss how seeing them made for the most anticipated gig I'd attended up to that time in my life. Well, this David Bowie concert, 1 year later at the same venue, but utilizing the full stadium, left that prior show's sense of anticipation in the dust as I finally got to see the performer who had long occupied the #1 spot on my must-see list. Bowie and his 70s output made a seismic and enduring impact on my life. And in this next episode, I'll discuss this along with looking back at the actual show on that gorgeous Labor Day weekend in 1983, ending one of the most memorable summers of my young life with an unforgettable climax. And of course, also the great Rough Trade. I love Rough Trade. Another act who made a big impact on me when I heard about them in the mid-70s. hearing their first album early 77, and then through the 80s, they were the opening act. I'll be talking about them as well. So tune in next time for life-changing radio oddities, bamboo steamers among the Bowie masses, and the most exciting show of my life with episode 29, concert number 22, Let's Dance. David Bowie with Rough Trade, CNE Stadium, Toronto, Ontario, Canada, Saturday, September 3rd, 1983. And as a preview, you can also read the initial blog entry at mylifeinconcert.com, broken down into two blogs, 22A, Changes, Bowie, the 70s, and Me, and 22B, the show about the concert. So check that out, and of course the mylifeinconcert.com blog. I'd like to remind you to please also like, follow, subscribe, and hit the notification bell where applicable on our Facebook, YouTube, and Instagram pages. And please leave your memories of any of the gigs that I'm writing about on the platform of your choice. And once again, there's the two Spotify playlists for this episode: MLIC Prompt, Marianne Faithfull, Time Span C90, 1964 to 2021, and MLIC Prompt, Marianne Faithfull, Dangerous Acquaintances, VA's Fave Tracks, 1964 to 2021. And finally, if you've enjoyed the podcast, please be sure to tell your Tunehead friends about the sprightly and satisfying experience that is mylifeinconcert.com. I'd like to say a big thanks once more to listeners both new and returning for taking the time to tune in. This is your host, Various Artists, signing off, and we'll meet up at the next concert. See you then and see you there. Bye for now.